And now we have Rani from the ILO. She will open the floor and discuss with us the situation of platform workers global. Uma, take the floor. You can do it much better than anyone else. Uma is an economist. That's always good to know. And welcome.
Thanks a lot, Pauline, for inviting me for this webinar series on Grip on Pay. And can I share my screen if you don't mind?
You should.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Gosh.
Yes, I am able to do that. Yeah. Too many things happening on the screen. One sec. Yeah. So thanks a lot for having me here for this webinar on Grips on Pay. So what I'm going to do is actually follow up on this very nice video that was shown by presenting you some of the key findings relating to the pay from our report that was published last year, The Role of Digital Labor Platforms Transforming the World of Work. Now, very clearly, as the video also showed, that platforms are here to stay, and they have been rising almost fivefold over the past decade. And there are a number of reasons why platforms have become very important. It's not only the availability of cloud computing and cloud infrastructure, but I think it is much more the usability of big data for different types of purposes that has made platforms even more important and there to stay. Because big data is not only being utilized to predict what are the kind of products and services that can be given. There's a lot of monetization of data that is happening as a result of it, but it is also used for algorithmic management practices, that is for different purposes, not only within the platforms, but it is going beyond the digital labor platforms to traditional workplaces tomorrow and today. And that's where it has become very key and important. And all of this would not be possible if the venture capital funds were not available to actually finance these platforms. And as they are interested in data and algorithm and artificial intelligence, there's a lot of money that is being actually invested in it. And surely the COVID-19 pandemic very clearly showed how these platforms provide for certain kinds of flexibility and innovative ways of working. And we have also seen quite a bit of rise of remote working as a result of it. So very clearly, platforms are there to stay. And I think we have to address some of the issues that are linked with it. And I think one of the issues that also comes out with the platforms is how there is a digital divide that exists, both in terms of investments, but also in terms of revenue, where you find very clearly that these platforms are actually concentrated in certain parts of the world as far as the registration is concerned. And if you look at the revenues, about 70% of the revenues actually go to two countries, United States and China. And this creates also huge implications on ensuring any kind of worker protection to the workers, especially the social protection part. And I think that's important for us to look at. Now, how does pay actually get affected? And I think part of it has to do with the nature of the business model itself. When you had traditional firms, a traditional firm would take up the responsibility of fixing the pay and ensuring that the workers have at least some sort of a decent pay, depending upon the kind of contracts that they were being given. But I think with platforms, what is happening is they've become very asset light. They do not actually hold or own the capital that they run. And all of that is actually transferred on to the workers. So there are certain very fundamental features of platform business model today that have an impact on the workers' income and pay. And the first one is the whole shifting of responsibility that takes place, where it is the worker who has to own not only the capital asset, but also the operational cost, whether it be maintenance of your car or your electricity or internet charges or whatsoever. And all of this actually is to be deducted from the incomes they get, which would normally not be the case in a traditional business model. The second thing is how human resource management practices are undergoing a change, where you have today, through these platforms, algorithms that actually start allocating the work to the worker, They monitor using different tools how the worker is performing the job or not. And then it evaluates, sometimes algorithmically, sometimes through a community of workers on the platforms, or through based on other indicators where the responsibility sometimes shifts to the customers, and then it decides whether a payment is to be made to the worker or not. So there's a huge dependence on not only algorithms, but a number of other factors for a worker to get the final income in their hands. The third important shift that is happening, which is from the ILO's viewpoint very important, is how these workers are actually classified. Now, one can argue that, okay, all economies have these kinds of workers, that is a self-employed or independent contractors. What is quite new? I think what is very new is that it is actually within the core of the business model, the way it is constructed, that becomes very problematic, where you have the platform business or the company having a very small workforce, which is a core workforce, which actually mediates millions of workers. So if you want to take the case of people per hour, a platform, you have about 50 core workers who actually mediate 2.4 million workers who are actually classified as freelancers or independent contractors or self-employed, and they do not have any sort of a labor or social protection. And workers have to invest in a lot of protection, whether it is as health, whether it's the pension or whatsoever as they go by. Now, one might argue that self-employed workers in the traditional enterprises also, or in the traditionally also did that. I think the difference is that a traditional self-employed worker, whoever it was, they could actually bargain and decide what the price for their service or a good is. And that negotiation power is no longer there with the worker today on the platform, because it is literally the race to the bottom. And this is where it becomes very problematic. And I can show you some interesting figures with regard to that. Now, for the work that we did as part of a report, we looked at a number of online labor platforms, that is a freelance, contest-based, microtask, competitive programming. They're all very different, but it's very interesting that there's some very common elements that are there. And then we looked at taxi and delivery, some very male-dominated sectors in the location-based, because it was not very easy for us to get into the female-dominated sectors. Rather, one of the participants, Saloni, worked quite closely with me, trying to make inroads into domestic workers and beauty workers and tutors, and it was extremely difficult. But we haven't given up, and we are looking at those sectors now. But what I want to show you is that you can look at any of the platforms, but there are some very common elements that are there in the business model. And as I mentioned earlier, the algorithmic management practices, actually, they rule the entire process. Now, we all have heard that ratings is one of the key indicators for workers to actually start accessing work on the platform, and also to command a price on the platform. If you do not have a good rating, it's not possible for you to get certain jobs, especially if you're on the freelance platforms or taxi platforms or delivery platforms, any platforms that you take into consideration. You will not get access to work, and then on freelance, you will not be able to dictate the price that you would like to have. Now, what we have also seen is that while all of these indicators are sometimes talked about, whether it's client reviews, rating, worker profiles, or looking at project histories or the rate proposed by workers, in the case of freelance platforms, there are other things that are happening which are not actually visible to many people. And that is that you can actually pay to the platform a fees to have more visibility, or to have your proposal or a bid up on the ranking so that it is actually picked up. So what is happening in the process, and some of the platforms actually also have bids or connects where you then apply. So in the whole process, these platforms shift the entire cost burden of the process onto the workers, and make them pay if they want to be able to get a particular task. Now, this is very good for the platform and very good for the client, because then the client knows that this work can be done in a very quick way. Now, this has implications on the worker's income. The second thing is a revenue model. All platforms charge commission fees. Probably the exceptions are microtask platforms and some of the competitive programming platforms. These commission fees range between 15% to 40% depending upon the platforms. And that is very integral to the platform revenue model. And one of the platforms, we found that 62% of the revenue of the platform actually comes from charging commission fees to the workers alone. So that's the second point that has a huge impact on the workers' income. The third is the entire issue around, the flexibility that it's talked about. That, you're very flexible in deciding whether you want to do a job or not. It's not as flexible as we think. And this is what even the workers tell us based on the interviews we've had. And there, what we do find is, especially in taxi and delivery, if you do refuse a task, what happens is that, or you cancel your task, it has repercussions on you in three kinds. Your rating can be reduced. Number two, what happens is that you might not get work for a few hours to few days to few weeks. And sometimes the third thing happens is you are deactivated from the platform itself. Now, this has huge implications for the workers' income per se. And workers are on a regular basis actually tracked. And the final thing is that all these platforms have their rules of governance, which goes about very clearly defining what are the conditions of work on these platforms, which is unilaterally determined by them, whether it be in terms of exclusivity clauses, dispute resolution mechanisms, or deactivation of accounts. So this has implications on the workers, because on microtask platforms, you can do the work, and your work can be rejected by the algorithm. But the worker cannot actually contest it or even find out why the work was actually rejected. And that makes it very difficult for any worker to know what is happening into the entire process. So I think there are certain elements within the business model that need to be changed if we have to have a grip over the pay on these platforms. And I'm just going to quickly show you some of the findings based on the interviews and surveys we did with about 12,000 workers across these platforms in about more than 100 countries. So one of the first things that we do notice is that the earnings vary depending upon the type of platform. Like if you're talking about microtask, it's about $3.3, while in freelance, it is about $7.6. And we have seen that this pay is far below the minimum wage of even any of the respective countries where the workers are actually working in. And if you combine them together, you find that the average that we get on online platforms is about $3.4 per hour. And if you look at the median income of these workers, it's about $2 per hour. The second aspect that is very important within the online to look at is that there are huge differences or gaps that exist between earnings between workers in developed and developing countries. That's about 60%. Now, why does this happen? This happens for various reasons. And one of the reasons why it happens is that workers actually underbid themselves or do the task for free so as to establish their profile onto the platform and to ensure that over a period of time, they would try to get regular work. So, there is these perverse things that are happening over the platform as a result of, workers being bidded against one another, trying to actually get the job into the global labor force. The second thing that we very clearly see is that there is a significant gender pay gap on many of the platforms at the country level, while at the global level, we do find that the results are quite fixed. And the third important point is that, Valeria is going to talk a bit more about the unpaid work, but one thing that we see is that on online platforms, workers spend about 8 hours in a typical week performing unpaid work. That's a huge amount of work. time that they are spending, which is not part of their pay per se. Now, this would be very different if you were a self-employed worker, because you would build in a lot of these costs while you actually say what the price of the job is. Now, on location-based platforms, as we did these surveys across a range of developing countries, you find that it ranges depending upon the sector and depending upon the country. But what was quite interesting to see is that workers on platforms earn more than the traditional counterparts, both in the taxi and delivery. And part of the reason was largely because the taxi sector was disrupted very badly in all these countries. As a result, many of them were not getting the jobs. And because the price of a ride of a taxi driver through a platform is far lower, it became very difficult for them to attract consumers to actually take the ride. Everybody forgets within this element that actually this entire lowering of the price on taxi platforms is being done through the venture capital funds that are being made available. So there's a huge subsidization that is happening, but this happens only for a limited period of time. And after a certain period, this is not the case. And what we also see is that when taxi drivers have to earn a decent income, they spend a long working time. And this is about 65 hours on average on taxi sector. And in India, we found that about workers in the taxi sector were working about 80 hours per week. And they were in delivery sector working about 59 hours per week. And the final point I'd like to make with regard to earnings is the whole commission fees that takes place, which ranges depending upon the sector from 5% to about 35%. I think I haven't got into the details about how workers do not get paid for the work they have done often. And this is something that you see largely in freelance and on microtask platforms. The second point I'd like to quickly make is it's not only low pay, but it's also poor social protection coverage. And if you look at the right-hand side, you can see what the numbers look like, that there are huge gaps in health insurance, work-related injury provision, or unemployment, or even disability insurance as such. And we did find that during COVID-19, this left many of the platform workers at risk. And this is something very important for us to look at. Now, we at the ILO go about arguing for not only handling the issue of pay, but we talk about looking at the issue around employment status, right to bargain collectively, dispute resolution mechanisms, but we also get into the whole issue of transparency and accountability in algorithms and ratings and data protection, and how there should be a discussion also about portability of worker data and ratings if we want to actually address the issue of providing secure incomes and work to workers on these platforms. Thank you very much.
Great, Uma. Really, this was the excellent way of setting the floor. So far, there are not yet questions for you, but I'm sure they will come. And you provoke the idea that it should be way more decent as it is now and way more creative to do that. So thanks a million for this, and stay with us.